everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the HFI podcast. And today I'm joined by Robert Spencer. And today we're going to be discussing, did Muhammad exist? And we're also going to discuss his work on the critical Quran. So I have the links to purchase his books in the description below and in the pinned comments. So if you want to go get yourself copies of those books, you can do so. And that being said, Robert, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good to talk to you again, Jacob. Thank you.
And thank you for coming on. So the first part of the show, I want to focus on Muhammad real quick. What leads to the question, did Muhammad exist? Is the evidence flimsy? Is the evidence self-contradictory? What is the problem of attempts to reconstruct a historical Muhammad?
The evidence is essentially non-existent. If you're talking about contemporary witnesses who speak about Muhammad at the time that he lived or was supposed to have lived or in the immediate aftermath thereof, there's essentially nothing. There are some scattered references to Muhammad, but none of them actually correspond to the descriptions of Muhammad that we see in the stories that come from the 9th century, from 200 years after he lived. And thus, if you're looking for the prophet of Islam, if you're looking for the man who did so many things that many people are familiar with today and that Muslims revere for doing those things, there's simply no record of him that's remotely contemporary. The first we hear about such a person is so far removed from when he's supposed to have lived as to make all kinds of mythical elaboration not only likely, but highly probable, so that we cannot figure out what exactly he may have said and done, or even if he existed at all.
So does most of our information about Muhammad come from extra Quranic sources?
Yeah. A lot of people think that the Quran is all about Muhammad, but you can't read the Quran and come away with that idea. And it must be noted that most of the translations of the Quran into English are highly misleading in this regard, because they add in what is not in there, multiple mentions of Muhammad. For example, the Quran frequently has Allah telling the messenger or the prophet what to say. And Allah quite literally says, say, and then tells him what to say. Like, say this, tell them this. And in many English translations of the Quran, it says, say, O Muhammad. Whereas in the Quran, the real Quran, the Arabic Quran, there are only 4 mentions of Muhammad by name. And none of them give us any information about his life or what he was like, nor does any other material in the Quran. And meanwhile, the Quran itself is quite elliptical and elusive without giving us the details of the stories that it discusses. And so for both the biography of Muhammad and for the elementary and essential details about much of what the Quran is discussing, you have to go to the Hadith. Now, the problem is that the Quran supposedly dates from between 610 and 632, and the Hadith start to appear in the 9th century, which is 200 years removed from the events they're supposed to have discussed. And so we have to believe that the people who transmitted these stories orally had perfect recall and didn't change anything. And this is actually an essential article of Islamic faith, because if you think that they didn't have perfect recall and have all these things down exactly as they were told them, then you can't trust any of the stories about Muhammad.
What little does the Quran even say about Muhammad at all in those 4 mentions that you brought up?
Well, we can look at them. One of them, for example, is chapter 48, verse 29, which says, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah, and those who follow him are ruthless to unbelievers, merciful to one another. Another one is chapter 47, verse 2. And those who believe and do good works and believe in what is revealed to Muhammad, and it is the truth from their Lord. He rids them of their evil deeds and improves their condition. And then you have 3340. And that is, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets, and Allah is always aware of all things. And then you have 3144. Just a moment. And that one is, Muhammad is only a messenger. Messengers have passed away before him. Will it be that when he dies or is killed, you will turn back on your heels? He who turns back on his heels does no harm to Allah, and Allah will reward the thankful. That's it. And so people who think that Muhammad is a historical figure have very little to go on in terms of contemporary witness, because those four mentions are all that we have from the 7th century, and that in itself is assuming that the Quran dates from the 7th century, which I also think is doubtful because of the fact, for example, that Uthman, the third caliph, is supposed to have collected the Quran together in the year 653. Burned the variants and distributed the copies of the Quran to the provinces. And yet nobody quotes the Quran, nobody mentions it, nobody even gives a hint that it exists for another 40 or 50 years. And when John of Damascus, the Christian leader in the early 8th century, in the 720s, 730s, when he starts quoting the Quran and talking about it and talking about Islamic doctrine, he doesn't have the Quran that we have now. He refers to chapters that are not in the Quran, such as the Camel of Allah. There is no chapter, the Camel of Allah, in the Quran, along with chapters that are in the Quran, women and the table and so on. And that is an indication, I think, that the Quran did not exist in the form that it exists today at the time of John of Damascus, because he has no reason to misrepresent the situation. And he's saying, he actually speaks of the chapters of the Quran as if they're separate books. He says Muhammad wrote a number of ridiculous books, including women and so on. And he doesn't give any sign of knowing or being aware that these are all one book, just parts of one book. And so the easiest explanation for that is that they weren't part of one book at that time. So anyway, the point being that you've got these four scattered mentions of Muhammad, I just read them to you, very slight, filled with no biographical information. And that's the only thing we have from the 7th century, and even that may not come from the 7th century. There's talk about Quranic manuscripts having been discovered and so on. In the first place, those are very small fragments. And in the second place, it's not at all clear that those aren't source material for the Quran and not the Quran itself, because it does seem likely that the Quran was assembled from various earlier sources. So aside from the Quran, you have several other mentions of Muhammad that you'll find in Did Muhammad Exist? And they say Muhammad did things or said things that there's no record of him doing or saying such things in Islamic tradition. So you got to wonder, are they talking about the same guy? It's also possible that the name itself is not a name, because nobody had this name before the Prophet of Islam. It does mean the praised one, the one who is being praised, and consequently some people have posited that it's a title, that it is a title that is given to various people and only became associated with one particular individual later when it became expedient to create the figure of Muhammad.
Could you expand on that? Because I think some also suggest that Muhammad was actually even a reference to Jesus himself, apparently, at some point.
Yeah, that's right. And that actually comes from coins that Muawiyah and other early caliphs. Muawiyah was the caliph from 661 to 680, and he minted coins that some of them have crosses on them and the word Muhammad. Now, this is extremely incongruous because Islam hates the cross. There's a prophecy of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, that Jesus will return at the end of the world and break the cross, kill the pig, and abolish the jizya, which essentially means he will destroy Christianity, which reveres the cross and eats pork, and abolish the jizya, which is the second-class status under which Christians, as well as other so-called people of the book, can practice their faith as long as they're subservient to the Muslims. And that means, in other words, that this Jesus will come back and conquer the world for Islam, and all the Christians will have to become Muslim or die. And so the idea of the cross and Jesus breaking the cross comes from the assumption that it's an insult to Allah to say that his prophet, as Jesus is in Islam, in the Quran, would be crucified, that Allah couldn't protect him. And so the Quran itself says in chapter 4, verse 157, they did not kill or crucify him. It just seemed to them as if they did. So they thought they crucified him, but they were actually crucifying somebody else, which is in itself a strange statement, but that's for another time. And so he's not crucified, and at the end of the world, he will break the cross. And then Muawiyah puts crosses on his coins. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Islam if we assume that Muhammad actually existed and that Muhammad actually said these things, and that the Muslims presumably would remember. Muhammad died in 632, supposedly, and Muawiyah became caliph in 661. That's not that long. That's not a big dip. What is that? 29 years. Well, I remember things I was doing 29 years ago. Maybe you're too young to remember such things, but nonetheless, it's not that tremendous a distance. And so Muhammad says the cross is this abomination. Muawiyah is not going to put crosses on the coins, especially with the name Muhammad, unless, and this is the best explanation, those stories had not yet been invented. And so Muawiyah had no hesitation putting crosses with Muhammad on his coins, because the cross represented the religion of a great many of his constituents, his subjects, and Muhammad was a title that referred to probably to Jesus himself, or maybe to somebody else.
So the Quranic Muhammad, who do you think this Muhammad in the Quran could be a reference to? Is this in itself possibly a fictional character, or is this just a throwaway reference to some other figure that could have lived in any time, I guess?
The four mentions of Muhammad that we read could refer to Jesus as the praised one. They could refer to some other prophet or messenger. It seems to me most likely that the Quran and also the traditions about Muhammad from the 9th century were constructed from pre-existing material, many of which may have had to do with people who are claiming to be prophets at various places and times in this region in this rough period in which all this came together. And so you have various stories being folded into the story of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and becoming part of it. And so they could originally have referred to someone else. The Quran quite often refers to the messenger without naming him. And so here again, that's assumed nowadays to be Muhammad. And all the mainstream scholars assume that that's Muhammad is being referred to. But the Quran itself doesn't say, and there doesn't seem to be any necessary reason why that would have to be referring to Muhammad at all, since there doesn't seem to have been a Muhammad at the time that these stories were put together.
Isn't there another Muhammad that was apparently found, but the issue is, even though he lived in the same century as Muhammad was supposed to have lived, he died later in that century.
I don't know. I don't know what you're referring to there.
Mhm.
There's a Muhammad in Islamic tradition, Muhammad bin Maslama, who is a follower of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, and he kills Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, who is a critic of Muhammad and is rewarded by the Prophet. And so in Islamic tradition, Muhammad's not the only one to hold this name, but I don't know. Maybe that there's been some other Muhammad discovered somewhere. My impression is that the Muhammad of Islam is the first one to bear this title as a name.
Yeah, if I can remember, I'll bring it up again. But in any case, when do you think the Quran actually came into existence?
I think that there were parts of it in existence by the 690s, because you get the inscriptions on the wall of the Dome of the Rock. And the inscriptions on the wall of the Dome of the Rock consist of a great many quotations from the Quran strung together. What's interesting about them is that they start with the messenger is there. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, and then goes on to explain that the messenger is only a servant and is not divine, and so on, and goes on to speak about Jesus and how Jesus is not divine and not the Son of God, and so on and so on. And so what you have to believe, if you accept the standard story regarding the Dome of the Rock inscriptions, is that it starts out by talking about Muhammad and then changes the subject to talk about Jesus at great length without any explanation or notice. What's much more likely is that when it says Muhammad at the beginning part, it's using it as a title, as the praised one, and then going on to continue to speak about Jesus. But there are those passages in that inscription that are in the Quran. And so people have assumed all this time that the Dome of the Rock was quoting the Quran. But it's also possible, given the total absence of quotations from the Quran before this, it's very possible, and I think actually likely, that the Quran passages from the inscription, they were first put on the wall and then put into the Quran when it started to be gathered together. 20, 30 years later, it's when John of Damascus, the Christian writer that I mentioned earlier, starts to criticize Islam and quote from the writings of Muhammad as he represents them. And so the John of Damascus, he seems to be aware of the Quran, but as I explained, it's not the Quran in quite the same form as we have it now. Also, there's a guy from around the same period who says that he's read the Quran and he's read Surah al-Baqarah. Surah al-Baqarah is actually the second chapter of the Quran. So you don't usually speak that way when you're talking about books. If I ask you, Jacob, have you read the Brothers Karamazov? You would not answer, yes, I've read the Brothers Karamazov and chapter 2 of it. It wouldn't be necessary. And so it's much more likely that when this fellow was writing, which is around the time of John of Damascus, in the early part of the 8th century, that Surah al-Baqarah, which is the longest and most important chapter of the Quran, was not actually part of the Quran yet, and comes about, gets folded into the book later on.
I believe I figured out what I was not remembering earlier. I was partially remembering there was a inscription to it was the rock inscription in Jerusalem in which it mentioned Muhammad, but it's supposedly dated to the 650s AD. And I think some took it to indicate that this somehow portrayed Muhammad as living a couple of decades after he supposedly died.
Well, I don't know. I'd have to see it, but there are some mentions of Muhammad, as I noted, in the latter part of the 7th century, but none of them correspond to Muhammad as we know him from Islamic tradition. Some of them say that he led armies into Syria, which he didn't do. Some of them say that he preached to the coming Messiah, and it is an idea in Islam that Jesus will return at the end of the world, but it's not at all the kind of messianic expectation that exists in Judaism or even in Christianity in represented as fulfillment. This is a completely different idea in Islam, where actually Jesus is called Jesus Christ or Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, but it's practically like a proper name. It's like it's his last name. It doesn't have any significance in the religion at all. And so the idea that Muhammad is preaching the coming of the Messiah has no basis in any of the stories that we have about Muhammad that come from later. And so this raises the question of whether these really are early references to Muhammad at all, or references to somebody else altogether who's being referred to by this as a title.
Are there contradictory stories about Muhammad's death in the Hadith?
Yeah, plenty. The Shiites, for example, say because they hate the wives of Muhammad, Hafsa and Aisha. Hafsa and Aisha, according to the Shiites, well, actually, according to the Sunnis as well, were great enemies of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the great hero of the Shiites, who is the son-in-law of Muhammad. And the Shiites say that he was the appointed successor of Muhammad. But Aisha denied that, and according to Islamic tradition, not only denied it and made sure that he was passed over as caliph, as successor of Muhammad to lead the Muslims, it's still something that led to tremendous, there was still such tremendous bitterness between the two of them that she actually, during the caliph, when Ali finally did become caliph, she actually led armies against him and then instigated Muawiyah's rebellion against him, which led to his being killed and Muawiyah replacing him as caliph. This is the antagonism between the Sunnis and the Shia. But in any case, to your question, the Shiites actually say that Hafsa and Aisha killed Muhammad. And the Sunnis say that it was a Jewish woman who poisoned Muhammad, and he suffered the poisoning for a couple of years before he finally succumbed to its effects.
In page 48 in the book, you mention a coin described by numismatist Volker Popp, a Syrian coin with the Muhammad motto, but that would put Muhammad in the 680s AD. Can you expand on what that's all about?
Well, it would only put Muhammad as a person in the 680s if this coin is referring to a living person. Some of the people who say that Muhammad actually existed point to this coin and others like it to support the idea that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, actually did exist, and he's being commemorated on this coin like a contemporary coin from Saudi Arabia or some other Islamic state might bear the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith. There's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And while that's possible, it wouldn't require Muhammad to be alive at the time. The only problem with the coins is, as I noted, that some of them, including ones that say Muhammad on them, have the crosses, which would be very strange that Muslim entities would produce coins containing the name of the prophet along with a symbol that they abominate. It just isn't likely to happen. It would be like the state of Israel putting out coins with a swastika on them. There's no likelihood of this. And so the only way you can really explain it is to understand that Muhammad as the prophet of Islam didn't exist yet. And so the situation was much different at the time that these coins were produced, and they're not referring to the prophet of Islam at all.
What do you think was the cause of creating the character of Muhammad?
It seems to me that you had the massive Arab Empire that was assembled very quickly, and the people who were running it wanted to keep it going. They cast about for a way to ensure its unity and created the religion accordingly. At that time, at the time of the rise of the Arab Empire, there were two great powers in the world, the Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. And both of them were held together by a common religion. The Roman Empire was Christian, the Persian Empire was Zoroastrian. When the Arabs amassed their great empire, they assembled this religion, they created this religion in order to provide an impetus for its unity. That's how empires were unified in those days. There weren't constitutions or parliaments. It was a matter of having a common faith. This is why in the Roman Empire, the emperors were so intent on having the Christians settle what exactly they believed and iron out their differences and have a common faith, because it was a political necessity. He might not have cared particularly about what they thought from a religious standpoint, or maybe he did, but or any given emperor might have cared less. But the point is, the religious unity of the empire was necessary so as to cement its political unity. And so it's the same thing with Islam. The Arabs took a creedally vague Abrahamic monotheism that seems to have existed before Islam, and there's still traces of it in the Quran and the references to the Hanifa, the pre-Islamic monotheists, and the reference that Abraham and other figures from the Bible were Hanifa. And they took this Abrahamic monotheism and created Islam out of it. And it was martial and aggressive and supremacist and violent because these were military men who were putting it all together, and they wanted to inculcate and encourage the virtues that would help them to maintain and expand their empire.
What is the problem of the Battle of Siffin?
Though the problem of the Battle of Siffin is a very good indication that these stories of the life of Muhammad and the aftermath thereof are completely ahistorical. The Battle of Siffin is in the 650, 658, if I recall correctly, and it's the forces of Ali versus the forces of Muawiyah. In this, the Fitna war that Aisha had instigated against Ali because she hated him so much for reasons that are explained in Islamic tradition, but those traditions don't have any more historical value than any others. But in any case, according to these traditions, the armies are fighting, and one side puts Qur'ans at the tips of their spears and dares the other one to attack, and then they'll be attacking the Quran, you know. And it seems to me to be beyond belief that a whole crowd of soldiers, a whole army of soldiers, would have had Qurans that they're carrying around with onto the battlefield. Because remember, in those days, you couldn't mass produce these things. There are billions of Qurans in the world today, but in those days, every last one of them had to be copied out by hand. They were very, very expensive and rare artifacts. And so when I said earlier that Uthman supposedly distributed copies of the Quran to the provinces, to the Muslim provinces at that time, that means that the governor of the province had a copy. Maybe some of the major mosques had a copy, but that's about it. You're talking about 5 or 10 copies here or there. You can't have hundreds of people having them. They just don't have the money to pay for the entire book to be copied out. And if they did have it, they're not going to risk this priceless, expensive thing by carrying it into a battlefield where it can be dropped onto the ground, trampled into the mud, torn to pieces, and lost. And so that in itself shows that the stories themselves don't have any historical value. That the story of the Battle of Siffin is written from the time that the time a couple hundred years after the battle is supposed to have taken place. And nobody who put it together obviously was thinking about the sheer logistical difficulties of what they're saying or the improbability of it all. Anyway, the battle itself may have taken place. However, the details of it, like the details of the Sunni-Shia split, are lost to history and are covered over by these mythical tales. But here again, the idea that they had all these books and are being so free with them absolutely strains credulity.
What do you make of the problems with Muhammad, the argument from embarrassment that's used to try to defend his historicity?
Yeah, this is a very common argument nowadays. People say, why would anyone invent a story that makes their guy look bad? Like marrying a 6-year-old and all that. And in the first place, we have to remember that what makes him look bad to us does not necessarily make him look bad to people in the 7th or 8th or 9th centuries. And so what makes them think that they would have been too embarrassed to invent this is that they're working from modern moral assumptions that the people who formulated these stories didn't necessarily share. It's likely that the people who invented the idea that he married the 6-year-old or incorporated that into the Muhammad myth from earlier sources, they did so because they approved of such activity and wanted to perpetuate it. And so they put his seal of approval on it. And that's the other possibility, that these stories weren't invented at all by people who gave any thought either way to whether these made the prophet look bad or not, but they were taken into the Muhammad myth from stories of earlier alleged prophets. And so the earlier alleged prophet may have done these things, and then they get folded, the stories get incorporated into the Muhammad legend.
So now, when were these various books, before they were collected into the Quran? When would you say that they were written, these various books? Were they written in the same century or several centuries? What's going on there?
Well, like I said, you have Quran passages on the wall of the Dome of the Rock. That's 691. You have Quran being quoted, although he indicates that it's not in its final form in various ways, in the 720s or 30s by John of Damascus. By the late 8th century, you start to have more quotations. And by the 9th century, the time that the hadith start to be produced or start to appear, you have extensive quotations and commentary on the Quran. So it seems as if it's most likely a product of around the late 7th century and the early part of the 8th, and comes into its final form by the latter part of the 8th century. And that's about 100, 150 years after it's supposed to have appeared.
How many different Qurans existed around that time?
Well, that's a very interesting question because there are quite a few Qurans that exist today. Uh, Hatun Tash, who is a very courageous ex-Muslim from Turkey, went into Morocco and started to look for variants in Quranic texts, and ultimately found about 35 or 40 different published versions of the Quran that had variations on the text. And Muslims have a whole apologetic narrative about this, that Muhammad was revealed the Quran in 7 dialects. But these aren't really dialects at all. This isn't a matter of one group of Arabs says a word one way and another says it another. There is actually difference in wording and sometimes difference in meaning. Nothing major, but enough to explode the idea that this is the perfect book that's been perfectly preserved. And it seems as if there are quite a few variations that came from competing versions of the Quran at first, which were suppressed at various points, and yet elements of them survive. I actually have in the Critical Quran an appendix with some Shiite chapters of the Quran that even the Shiites reject today, but they did circulate at one time, or of course they wouldn't exist at this point at all. And they indicate that there was quite a bit more variation to the Quranic text than most people admit.
So when did they start attempting to control which Quran would be the main thing? When did that start happening?
I think 1924 is probably your best bet for that. 1924 is the collection of the Quran in Cairo, I believe it was, and the standardization of the text, so that nowadays, if you buy a Quran in one area, if you buy a Quran in Los Angeles and you go over to Riyadh and buy another, it's likely to be the same text. But that text is standardized in 1924, doesn't go beyond that. And there are still, as Hatun demonstrated by buying 40 different Qurans, there's still quite a lot of variant. There are still quite a few variants that are readily available today.
Are the differences between these different Qurans minor or huge?
Oh, they're pretty much all minor. And it's not really so much the idea that they change the Quran radically or something of that kind. The real problem is that they exist at all, because the standard dogma in Islam is that Muhammad dictated every word of the Quran through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, and that it's the perfect copy of the perfect book that existed forever with Allah in paradise. And so you can still find Islamic apologists today, although in the last few years this has changed drastically, but there's still some who are a little slow on the uptake, and they will claim to you, it was a common apologetic point as recently as 5 years ago in the West. They would say, you know, the Bible, there are so many different variations in the text from the ancient manuscripts, but you look at the Quran manuscripts and every last one is exactly the same as the other. And there's never been a variant. The perfect preservation of the Quran is a sign that Allah, it is Allah's book and Allah is protecting it. You can find on X, on Twitter today, you can find references, you can find Islamic preachers like Yasser Qadi saying that in videos, that every last copy is identical to every other copy. Well, there are just simply too many variants to maintain that. And now Yasser Qadi has admitted, although it was quite a controversy and the video was scrubbed and so on, but some non-Muslim polemicists, they caught the video and preserved it. But he was saying that there are holes in the narrative, and that the idea of perfect preservation cannot be sustained in light of the many variations in the Quranic text. But then that raises the question of how is it that Allah delivered this perfect book and yet there are different versions of it? No matter how minor, that explodes the whole narrative.
Can you talk about Muhammad's non-Arabic sources that seems to contradict the claims of the book's Arabic origins?
Yeah, sure. There are plenty of words in the Quran that are foreign words. And there's even a kind of defensive passage that says, they say that he's getting this from somebody else, but the person they're referring to is foreign, and this is pure, clear Arabic. Well, it's not pure, clear Arabic, not all through. There are plenty of foreign words in it that don't make any sense in Arabic and can only be understood by reference to other languages. There are even words that don't make any sense at all. And the only understanding of them comes from Islamic scholars who've essentially assigned them a meaning through conjecture. And they have a meaning in Islamic tradition, but that's not a meaning that goes beyond Islamic tradition at all. These are words that are completely unknown otherwise. And so the idea that it's pristine, pure Arabic falters on the facts.
So what do you mean by the absence of Arabia?
Well, the other aspect of this whole problem of Muhammad is that Mecca did not exist as it is described in the Hadith, in the Sirah literature, the stories about Muhammad's life in the 7th century. And so you have, for example, tradesmen who kept meticulous books and records of where they sold things and what they sold, and records, of course, of their route. And they did this not for history. They did this to keep track of where they had sales so they could go back there, just like salesmen do today. And it's very clear that they went from Constantinople or farther west in Europe into India, and they went pretty much a straight line across. They did not, in other words, take a several hundred-mile detour south into the across trackless desert wastes to get to southwest Arabia, where Mecca is. And there's no mention of Mecca, and no record of it on maps, and no record, as I say, in the accounts, in the records of these tradesmen for another couple hundred years after Muhammad. And yet, when you read the Hadith, everything takes place in Mecca. When you read about Muhammad's life, Mecca is this thriving center of trade and pilgrimage, and the Quraysh, the tribe that Muhammad comes from, they rejected him because they thought that he would threaten their trade and pilgrimage business. And Mecca actually did not, there's no way that it could have been or was that kind of a thriving center of commerce and religion at the time of Muhammad. And so the whole setting and a great deal of the justification for the actions that take place in Muhammad's life, it has no historical basis.
Now, can you tell us about the problem with Zayd's death in the Battle of Mu'tah?
Zayd's death. Are you referring to Zayd, the husband of Zaynab?
Well, I'm talking about Zayd bin Haritha.
Yeah, Zayd bin Haritha, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Zayd bin Haritha is supposedly the husband of Zaynab. I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but I'm just going to go ahead and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Zaynab is a very pretty woman. This is according to the Islamic traditions. She's extremely good looking. And she's married to Muhammad's adopted son, Zayd bin Haritha, who's known as Zayd bin Muhammad, because he's Muhammad's adopted son. And one day Zayd is out, and Muhammad comes by to see him, and Zaynab answers the door, and she's not fully dressed. And Muhammad, because she was just thinking, it's her beloved father-in-law, she doesn't have to worry about being all covered up. And he gets flustered and runs away. And Zayd then, when he hears about this, he comes by and he says to Muhammad, I'll divorce her and you can marry her, because he realizes that Muhammad was overcome by her beauty. And so Muhammad says, no, keep your wife and fear Allah. But then Allah gives him a revelation that he shouldn't refuse what Allah wants to give him, and Allah wants to give him Zaynab. And so she's divorced from Zayd and married to Muhammad. And this, of course, causes scandal. This is actually one of the chief arguments for the existence of Muhammad, the criterion of embarrassment argument. This is the quintessential criterion of embarrassment argument, that Muhammad is so lecherous and so out of control that he compels his own adopted son to divorce his wife so he can marry her. And he marries his wife's ex-wife, he marries his son and I'm getting all tangled up here. Excuse me. He marries his adopted son's ex-wife, whereupon there's a scandal in the community that leads him to nullify adoption. You can find this in chapter 33 of the Quran, two references in 33:4 and 33, I forget the other one, but in any case, there are two references in chapter 33 to the impermissibility of adoption. And Zayd bin Muhammad starts calling himself Zayd bin Haritha again. He's not the son of Muhammad. And he marries Zaynab. It's okay, because Zayd is not really his son. So the scandal is gone. Now, this is something that non-Muslims have made fun of for centuries and mocked Muhammad for clumsily trying to cover up his own lustfulness and his own lack of self-control by actually outlawing adoption and making his adopted son, who had been his adopted son for a number of years, no longer his adopted son. And so a lot of the people who adhere to the criterion of embarrassment today, they say, you see, nobody's going to make up a story where Muhammad looks as bad as this, as self-serving, as selfish, as deceitful, and so on. However, there is another possibility that was raised by the scholar David Powers, and that hinges on 33:40, chapter 33, verse 40, where the story is elliptically referred to in leading up to this, very elliptically. You have to go to the Sirah literature to get the full story. But in 33:40, after it tells the story of how Allah marries Zaynab to Muhammad, it says, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men. Rather, he is the seal of the prophets. Now, this is very important. And Powers argues that it's the key to the whole story, and that there's nothing about embarrassment here. The whole story is designed to show that Muhammad is the last prophet, which is important for the stability of the community. If you keep having new prophets and they keep bringing new revelations, you keep having to revise the law and maybe the entire orientation of the empire. But if Muhammad's the last prophet, you can build on that as a foundation. So you want to rule out all the other prophets, any subsequent prophet. So you have to rule out that Muhammad has any sons, because the Quran envisions all the prophets as being related to one another, and their prophetic spirit is passed genetically. So if Muhammad had a son, he would have been a prophet too. And he had a son who died in infancy, so that takes or died as a young child, so that takes care of that problem. And then he has this adopted son, and just in case anybody thinks that the spirit of the prophet goes with him, you outlaw adoption. So Muhammad has no sons. He's the last prophet. And then the story makes perfect sense that Allah made the whole thing happen as to emphasize that Muhammad is the final prophet.
Can you tell us a little bit about Abdullah ibn al-Zubir's rebellion?
Well, Abdullah is another arrival of the establishment that created Islam. And he actually had to do with the creation of Islam himself. Abdullah az-Zubair was a claimant to the caliphate in the 680s and 90s, and that is around the time that we see the Dome of the Rock and the Dome of the Rock inscription with the reference to Muhammad as a prophet and the Quran passages, although it's not clear whether they come first or the Quran does. And in any case, Abdullah's headquarters were in Mecca. The Caliph, Abdul Malik, was not in Mecca. He was in Baghdad. And so it appears that they fought, well, it's certain that they fought a series of civil wars and that Abdul Malik prevailed. But it is also possible that Abdul Malik, as an effort to co-opt and incorporate the followers of Abdullah az-Zubair into his empire, he made Mecca not only a part of, but the center of the new religion. Because otherwise it was not needed. You already have the Dome of the Rock, and the Dome of the Rock does not have a Qibla. The Qibla is the niche in the wall of every mosque that points toward Mecca, that shows you which direction Mecca is, so you know which direction to pray in. Dome of the Rock doesn't have one, as if they're not envisioning praying toward Mecca. Like maybe this is the center of the religion. But then when he defeats Abdullah az-Zubair and wants to incorporate the Meccans into his religion, then suddenly everybody has to pray toward Mecca, which would explain another aspect of this mystery, which is that the earliest mosques don't point toward Mecca. They point toward Petra in Jordan, and consequently, you got to wonder, why is it that the mosques don't point toward what is supposedly the center of the religion? Here again, the obvious explanation is because it wasn't the center of the religion yet, and only became so later.
So what is the non-Arabic Quran?
Well, the Quran itself has a lot of passages in it that don't make a whole lot of sense. And so the scholar Christoph Luxemburg, he decided to see if maybe they were Aramaic. The Arabic language has 22 letters, but only 16 characters in the alphabet. And the other letters there are a lot of duplicate letters that are exactly the same as other letters, except for the dots that go above or below the letter, the points. The earliest Quran manuscripts don't have any of the points at all, which makes for a lot of possible variation in what's actually being said. And for example, this is the book. There is no doubt in it. That's toward the beginning of the Quran, beginning of chapter 2. And if you change the points on the letters with exactly the same letters as in the Quran manuscript, but you just change the dots that are above and below, then it'll say, this is the book, there is no oil in it. And so that kind of thing led the scholar Christoph Luxemburg to experiment, to strip out all the dots and to point the letters as if they were Aramaic instead of Arabic. And he found that a lot of the passages that don't make a whole lot of sense suddenly made perfect sense. And he posits that a lot of the Quran is made up of a Christian lectionary, a book of readings for worship that was radically reinterpreted and recast to create this Arabic holy book.
So why do you think that they created so many contradictory stories about Muhammad? How come they couldn't come to an agreement about, okay, we're going to stick with this made up story about Muhammad?
Because it wasn't just one group. There were competing factions in the early Arabic empires, and they were, once the idea of Muhammad as the prophet of a new religion had been invented, then various parties start to invent various stories about him, or to incorporate various stories about him from the stories of other people in order to justify the practices of their own faction within the community. And so you have a lot of contradictory stories about Muhammad because the various factions that were warring with one another, they both presented stories of Muhammad to justify their own perspective. And all those stories ended up getting included in the big Hadith collections. So there's not any one Muhammad in the Hadith. There are the different Muhammads of the different factions.
What would you say are, if you had to name like a couple, the top 2 or maybe the top 5 most major contradictions about Muhammad's life in these later sources?
Say that one of them is the idea that he said, don't kill civilians. And this is something you heard quoted a lot right after 9/11, that Muhammad said, don't kill women and children, and that therefore the 9/11 attacks were completely un-Islamic. And that was comforting to a lot of people. But there is another story where Muhammad says, where Muhammad is told, rather, that catapults are being used to throw stones into the encampment of the people that they're besieging, and there are women and children in there. And Muhammad replies with complete indifference. He says, they are among them, which was taken to mean, well, they're all the same. They're polytheists. They are enemies of Islam. Therefore, it doesn't matter. So is Muhammad in favor of civilian casualties, or is he against civilian casualties? And this is unclear. Another one is the idea of the successor of Muhammad, that the Shiites insist, and actually the Sunni Hadith also contain these stories, that Muhammad appointed Ali ibn Abi Talib as his successor. But the Shiites insist that that was something that was binding upon the community. And the Sunnis say, no, this is just something, he was just praising Ali, and it was not something that the community had to honor by making Ali the man in charge, and so on. And so you have drastically different understandings of the significance of those stories. You also have traces in the Quran itself, like, for example, the treatment of alcohol. In chapter 5, verse 90, it says alcohol is of some benefit. No, I'm sorry. Alcohol is Satan's handiwork. But elsewhere in the Quran, it says alcohol is of some benefit to human beings, which you got to wonder, if it's Satan's handiwork, how is it of some benefit? And earlier on, actually, the first stage is the Muslims are instructed not to go to prayers while drunk. So it's assumed that they're drinking, and the drinking is not condemned. They just shouldn't show up at prayers drunk. Okay. And then step 2 is alcohol is more bad than good, but it's of some benefit. And then finally, alcohol is from Satan. And so alcohol is forbidden today because of the third passage, but this contradicts the other ones, because if it's of some benefit, how is it that it's from Satan, the adversary of all mankind?
Can you tell us about some of the contradictions between these different Qurans that exist, some of the known ones?
Yeah. Happen to have one right here. And so let's see. There are small things, as I said, all the way through. For example, Right at the beginning, in the Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2, praise be to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. And a 17th century Shiite scholar, Muhammad Bakir Majlisi, says instead, we greatly praise Allah, the Lord of the worlds. Not a big deal, but here again, if this is all dictated perfectly by Allah and every last bit of it is perfectly preserved, how do these variants come about? Another one, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. I'm sorry, chapter 1, verse 3, the compassionate, the merciful, master of the day of judgment. In a variant from Cairo, we have the sustainer, the merciful, master of the day of judgment. And then master of the day of judgment itself, there is a Warsh Quran where it says king. The Warsh is a tradition of Quranic manuscripts, mostly in West Africa, king of the day of judgment rather than master of the day of judgment. And so on like that, let's see. For example, also chapter 2, verse 10, in their hearts is a disease, and Allah increases their disease. They will suffer a painful doom because they lie. And the Warsh Quran says, in their hearts is a disease, and Allah increases their disease. They will suffer a painful doom because they accuse others of lying. So who's lying? They lie, or they accuse others of lying, and so on. So all through the Quran, there are changes of that kind, variations of that kind from different manuscripts.
Can you tell us about the imperfections of the Qurans and the Hadiths and geography?
The geography is completely fanciful when it comes to Mecca, for example. There are a lot of descriptions of Mecca. It's interesting to note that, as I said before, Mecca doesn't really exist at the time of Muhammad. And so it's extraordinarily unlikely, actually virtually impossible, that the Hadith literature could be historical because the whole setting didn't exist. But there are physical descriptions of Mecca, some of them quite detailed, in various places in the Hadith. And they actually correspond more to Petra, which is interesting because Petra is where a lot of the early mosques point to. And it seems as if there was a center of something that became part of the new religion that was at Petra, that it got incorporated into the whole Muhammad myth later on.
I actually figured out earlier what I was misremembering. It wasn't necessarily an inscription that I was thinking. It wasn't necessarily the one that I was thinking of earlier. It's in page 24. And did Muhammad exist? You talk about the Battle of Gabitha, because it apparently it could be interpreted as a leader called Muhammad was involved in that battle, but it was 4 years after Muhammad's death. That's the one I was talking about.
Okay, let me go to it so I know exactly what you're referring to. Just a second. What page did you say?
24.
All right, let's see. Sorry, I didn't have it open, and I don't have a copy, but I do have the PDF, so just a moment. Okay.
No problem.
Page 24. Okay, the Battle of Gabitha is the Battle of Yarmouk. Okay, this is what I'm doing in this part of the book, is describing some of the early mentions of Muhammad and showing how the idea that they are referring to Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, is wildly unlikely. And what we have here is an inscription that's written in another manuscript. It's on the flyleaf of the other manuscript, dating from the 630s, and it says, in January, the people of Homs, so actually it just says Homs, but it's likely referring to the people, took the word for their lives, and many villages were ravaged by the killing of, and here again, it's the manuscript is elliptical, but people think that it was referring to the Tayyaya, or the Arabs of Muhammad, and many people were slain and taken prisoner from Galilee as far as Bath. And anyway, this is possibly a reference to Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, that many villages were ravaged by the killing of the Arabs of Mahmud. But on the other hand, Muhammad had already been dead, according to Islamic tradition, at this time. So while the Battle of Gabitha, which this is referring to, is generally identified with the Battle of Yarmouk, the Battle of Yarmouk took place after Muhammad's death. And so it's at best an ambiguous reference. There may have been a person named Muhammad, but you'll notice that in that inscription, as well as in all the other early mentions of Muhammad, there still isn't any detail that corresponds to the details about the Prophet of Islam that we get in Islamic tradition. So there may have been this warrior who did these things, but that's still a long way off from the Prophet of Islam.
If you had to name one thing, what would you say is the one biggest indicator that Muhammad probably didn't exist?
I think that the biggest indicator is the absence of contemporary reference. Because imagine if such a person did exist. I mean, like, take, for example, Islamic tradition at face value. And we have Muhammad conquering all of Arabia and unifying it. Why did nobody notice? The Byzantines are right there, and they have historians. And that was a direct threat to their southeastern territories. Why didn't they say anything about it? Why didn't they do anything about it? Muhammad is supposed to have written to Heraclius, the emperor, the Roman emperor, the Byzantine emperor. No record of that in the Byzantine archives. No record of that from Roman Byzantine historians. He's an awfully large figure, in other words, who unifies Arabia, and then right after that, his armies come out and they conquer half of the known world. And there's no doubt they did. The Arabs did conquer all this territory. Why is it that nobody ever mentions Muhammad? Why is it that nobody ever mentions Islam or the Quran? There's just a few scattered mentions of Muhammad that don't correspond to the Muhammad of Islam. And it seems to me that if you actually had a guy who did unify Arabia, and then right after he dies, his armies sweep out and start conquering the great powers of the day, somebody would go up to them at some point and say, why are you guys doing this? What motivates you? And they might start talking about the Quran and Islam and Muhammad. And yet, no mention of the Quran, no mention of Islam, only scattered mentions of Muhammad.
And for my final question, do we have any indication who these people were that wrote these various books in the Quran that became collected and became chapters of the Quran later?
No. It seems as if they were, well, I can tell you one thing, and that is Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. He was the governor of Iraq at the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th. And he worked with Abdul Malik, the caliph. And there is in Islamic tradition, there's a very interesting story where an old man says, we never read the Quran in mosques before the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. So I don't know if Hajjaj ibn Yusuf wrote the Quran, but it's noteworthy that an old man who's been around for years, and he's been going to the mosques. Only in the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, 40, 50 years after Muhammad, do they start to read the Quran. Maybe there was no Quran before then. Maybe, and also we don't know if the Quran they were reading at the time that he said that corresponds to the Quran that we have, because the one that John of Damascus seems to know a little bit later than this is not the same. And so you ask who put these things together. It seems as if people who were associated with the governing authorities of the Arabs put them together, and then they built it onto the existing system of mosques that were oriented toward the creedally vague Abrahamic monotheism that I mentioned before, and they make Islam out of it.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Robert Spencer.
Thank you.
And JM, thank you for your super chat and the thumbs up. Appreciate it. And just remind everybody before we close, all the links to Robert Spencer's books in the description below and the pinned comment.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.